NATO forces conduct major war games in Eastern Europe. What's the motivation for the massive military exercise? And what is Russia's response? Hello, I'm Anand Naidu, and this is The Heat. Earlier this month, NATO launched large-scale war games in Poland near the Russian border. The operation, called Anaconda, involved thousands of troops and military hardware from NATO member states. It's the largest such exercise since the end of the Cold War. Later in the show, we will have perspectives from Washington, Moscow and Europe, but we begin with CCTV's Jack Barton, who joins us from Brussels. And Jack, these war games sound like a major show of muscle, NATO military muscle. What's NATO's argument for conducting these military exercises right now?
Well, as you just mentioned, they are enormous. It's 24 countries sending 31,000 troops, thousands of weapon systems into Eastern Europe, the biggest war game since the end of the Cold War, but also the first time since the Second World War that German tanks have rolled all the way across Poland to approach the Russian border. And NATO is, of course, arguing that this is all about coordinating the forces, that it is either rotating through Eastern Europe or have as a standby rapid reaction force, and that includes the 40,000 strong rapid reaction force that's building, as well as the so-called Spearhead group, which can launch in within 48 hours. But NATO's also not hiding the fact that this is muscle flexing. It's all part of what US Defense Secretary Ashton Carter calls NATO's new playbook about moving away from reassuring member states to really aggressive deterrence. And so even NATO is really not backing away from the fact that this is muscle flexing and that these war games are a form of deterrence.
And what kind of response has there been from Russia to this?
Well, initially, at the start of the games, the Kremlin called it a threat to Russia. Moscow also pledged to hold war games as well on the country's west, and that's really what we've seen all along since the start of the crisis in eastern Ukraine, this tit-for-tat approach where Russia, then NATO, then Russia again hold these ever increasingly large war games. But in the past few days, we've really seen the rhetoric stepped up, with Russia saying that NATO is trying to push the region back into a new Cold War atmosphere. We've even heard from the deputy of Russia's Parliamentary Defense Committee saying they could deploy 2 new divisions or create 2 new divisions on the western border to counter NATO. But most of the rhetoric in the past few days has been to the new news out of this 2-day meeting that NATO plans to deploy thousands more troops into Eastern Europe near the Russian border.
Thanks, Jack. That's reporting from Brussels. And for more now, joining us here in Washington, D.C. is Michael O'Hanlon. He is a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution, and he's an expert on U.S. defense policy and military use. And also joining us via Skype from Basel in Switzerland is Jan Oberg. He is the director of the Transnational Foundation for Peace and Future Research based in Sweden. Welcome to both of you to the show. Michael, let me start with you. These NATO exercises are the largest to be held since the Cold War. Moscow says they are unjustified. Why is NATO carrying out these types of exercises at a time when there's heightened tensions between Moscow and the West?
Well, clearly NATO feels the need to reinforce the credibility of its deterrent and commitment to the eastern member states, lest there be any doubt in Moscow's mind that some or even most members of the alliance aren't really taking their commitments to the newest members seriously and would rather back down in the face of a new crisis with Russia rather than come to the support of a potentially threatened Baltic state or Poland or Romania, for example. The allies have decided that it's very important to show solidarity and unambiguous commitment to those member states. I take your point that the scale here risks provoking yet another round of back and forth at a time when the crisis in eastern Ukraine seems to have at least leveled off at a low simmer. But I think that NATO is aware that to leave any ambiguity about its willingness to invoke Article 5 in the event of an attack on a NATO member state would be a risk that just can't be tolerated. So I think that's the genesis of this big exercise, as well as the new rotational deployments of the battalions to the eastern member states.
Right. And do you think that there is unity among all NATO member states on this exercise and the planned build-up of NATO troops in the east, because there have been some reservations expressed both in France and in Germany. In fact, the former German Chancellor Gerhard Schroeder said the planned build-up is a serious mistake.
Well, with all due respect to the former Chancellor Schroeder, he is the former Chancellor Schroeder. He has one voice, but most of his compatriots would seem to disagree as a matter of government policy. This is a formal NATO exercise. Not everyone is equally enthusiastic. Not everyone is participating at the same scale, but it is, after all, an alliance exercise. I think the real question here would be, if there were a actual Russian military assault of one type or another on a member state, would all the allies collectively respond with military force? And my guess is, let's hope we never find out, my guess is that some would not, that some would play a more indirect support role, because everyone is basically allowed to interpret Article 5, the Mutual Defense Pact of the Alliance Treaty, as they wish in a given situation. Article 5 cannot commit any specific state to a specific action, and that's part of its strength, frankly, as long as the credibility of most of the partners, most of the allies responding is high enough to deter any kind of Russian action. So I think that's what it boils down to. On balance, this is a fairly strong show of alliance solidarity.
Jan Oberg, what do you make of these exercises and the planned build-up of troops and equipment by NATO in Poland and some of the Baltic states?
Way out of proportion of the problem. We're in a situation where during the Warsaw Pact, led by the Soviet Union, had about 70 to 80% of the military expenditures of NATO at the time. Today, Russia, standing alone, military percent of NATO's. Now, if you have a paranoid NATO being afraid of this and that, or if you seriously believe that Putin would be such an idiot in realpolitik terms to start a war when he has 8 horses and the others have 100 horses, I think we're far out. I mean, I think parts of the leadership in the West has lost sense of what is reality. They need a reality check. And if they like to play with taxpayers' money this way and make more tension than necessary, the very least they could do would be to learn from the leaders of Europe at the time of the First Cold War, where you had intellectuals and people with civil courage like Willy Brandt, Bruno Kreisky, Olof Palme, Urho Kekkonen, and others, who knew how damn dangerous these games were and therefore started the OSCE, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, and made confidence-building measures so that, you know, accidents wouldn't happen. And actually that was what paved the way for the ending of the Cold War. Now, 25 years later, we're in a situation where things are worse than they were at that time. I'm appalled by the policies of the West in a situation where they're way stronger and had no reason to be, hysteric about the threat from Russia.
Michael, do you believe that the NATO exercises are disproportionate? Because both the Russian President Vladimir Putin as well as the Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov have made it very clear that it would be, to use their words, insane for Russia to invade a NATO member state.
Well, you know, maybe they could be a little smaller. But I think Jan and some of the others you just mentioned are missing the main point here. Russia doesn't have to do an old-fashioned assault on all of NATO. It can try to chip away. It can try to contribute to a disturbance of Russian-speaking populations in Latvia, for example, which would then perhaps lead to a crackdown, which Russia could then use to invoke the right of protecting Russian speakers, which is a right that Putin has claimed for himself anywhere in the world, and try to seize a small piece of NATO territory, not with the intention of conquering all of the West, but with the intention of essentially the Baltic states, that they belong in his sphere of influence, and essentially assuming that NATO would rather back down than bring that overwhelming force to bear and risk nuclear war, where Jan forgot to mention that we actually have parity with Russia. We don't have 100 to 8 superiority in the nuclear domain, and Putin may be calculating that we would blink rather than go to the brink. I think it's important in this situation that deterrence not fail, that our commitment be unambiguous. I've been a supporter of trying to find ways to create a new Central European security architecture that would not involve the expansion of NATO, and I was never in favor of NATO expanding to the Baltic states in the first place. I don't think Sweden or Finland or Belarus or any of the other current neutral states should be in NATO either, because I don't want to see further provocation. But having said that, we now have an alliance that includes these countries, which were forcibly annexed by the Soviet Union about 70 years ago. And now that we have this commitment, I think it's important that there not be any shroud of doubt in Putin's mind mind that we would back it up. So even if the exercises perhaps could be a bit smaller, it's Putin that started this crisis in Central Europe, and we have to be clear about our commitments.
You make of that the fact that these two adversaries are not unequal. They have nuclear parity, for one, if it does get down to that. And, you know, to Michael's point, that it was Putin who started this.
The big issue here is that the war we are talking about is not on US territory, it's in Europe. And Europe is very close to Russia. There ought to be much more caution on the West. Because if you imagine that somebody was playing with the idea of a huge military alliance trying to make Mexico or Canada members of that alliance against the US, there would also be reaction and fear and maybe overreaction in Washington. Secondly, I don't know what is meant by Putin who started this. It's like, you know, we're in a sandbox. He was the one who started the game and all that. The facts are the following. 25 years after the Cold War ended, we've had 25 years where we could have created a better Europe, such a Europe that, for instance, Mikhail Sergeyevich Gorbachev suggested, with the United Nations based in Europe, with a strong OSCE. And as Mike said, instead we chose triumphalistically to expand NATO. Now, why should we not have done that? Because American presidents and foreign ministers like James Baker, Hans-Dietrich Genscher in Germany and others promised Gorbachev that one, NATO would not expand, and two, a united Germany would not be in NATO, but would be neutral. Now, these things were not written down, but it's on the records anyhow. So Clinton took over in, if I remember correctly, 94, and started the expansion. I happened to be in Tbilisi at the time, Georgia, and there I sat with the American representative, who was not an ambassador at the time, and he talked through a 2-hour conversation as this is our country. And the whole idea was, of course, to get as an expansion like the smiling crocodile around the rim, the outer rim of Russia, who historically has had not enough of invasions from the West.
Right.
Then came Ukraine. And let me just say very quickly, everybody knows, who has studied this and written books about it, that it was not Putin who started the regime change in Kiev. He reacted to what happened there, which I think was stupid and a clear international law by annexing Crimea. But you also know that if Ukraine would become a NATO member, the third largest base in Crimea would be in danger.
Right.
And nobody should be surprised that he reacted to this.
Michael, let's try and look at this from the Russian viewpoint. It's a 10-day exercise involving some 31,000 troops, thousands of military vehicles, and as we pointed out, it's the single largest movement of foreign forces in Poland since World War II. Let's look at the recent history of Russia. It lost 20 million people during World War II, faced more German divisions on its front than the Allies, the Western Allies, faced on D-Day. Given that, does one begin to understand Russia's anxiety?
No, not on that point. I think that's incorrect. I think Jan is closer to being correct when he talked about the psychological and the broader historical ways in which NATO expanded after the Cold War ended, and how that both seemed to invalidate some of the promises that had been made, at least verbally, and seemed to be a triumphalist action. But the notion that 30,000 NATO troops from 20 different countries that have publicly explained and debated their purpose for this exercise are somehow preparing an attack on Russia doesn't hold water, and we've got to not give that kind of argument serious credence. Okay, there are some Russian concerns that are worth debating, but that one simply doesn't even begin to hold water. So no, Russia doesn't have anything to fear from this exercise, and Russia did bring it upon itself because there are 10,000 people dead from what Russia's been doing in Ukraine the last 2 years. So even if Jan and I agree about the broad historical reasons why Putin could be angry about this, it doesn't justify killing 10,000 people. There is little ambiguity about who started the hot war in Ukraine. And Obama has been very careful not to provide the Ukrainian military with lethal weaponry. He's trying to give Putin a chance to back down. But he has a solemn pledge under Article 5 of the NATO treaty to protect any and all NATO members, and that has to be unambiguous. So even if I might quibble with the size of this exercise, I support its basic thrust.
Jan, do you want to respond to that? I've just got about a minute.
I mean, we can't talk here just as though we were journalists looking at one point at one moment. this is what goes together over 25 years. This is that Russia has to say stop somewhere. This goes together with all other kinds of expansions and the building of the ballistic missile defense system, which bizarrely is argued is not against Russia, but about Iran being a threat to Europe. I mean, give me a break. I do think that this exercise is part of a much larger provocative pattern and not something we should look at in isolation.
Michael, very quickly, 20 seconds, please.
Well, they're not a military threat, and I do hope that we can see that this can be the end of it. I would like this to be the only large exercise of this type, and I hope we can actually negotiate some kind of an agreement with Putin and with Russia on a neutral zone, a new security architecture for the currently neutral states of Europe, so we don't have to worry about NATO expansion. But the condition for that is Russian withdrawal militarily from Ukraine.
Okay, Michael O'Hanlon, Jan Oberg, we're going to have to leave it there. Thanks to both of you for joining us. We are going to take a short break right now. When we come back, what is the Russian reaction to NATO's war games? We'll talk with Dmitry Babich, a Russian journalist, right after this. Stay with us. You're watching The Heat. Welcome back to the show. We're talking about the massive NATO war games that were launched in Poland earlier this month. The large-scale military exercises along the Russian border have led to strong reaction in Moscow. Joining us now from Moscow is Dmitry Babich. He is a journalist and political analyst with Sputnik International. Dmitry, welcome to the show.
Yes.
What is the Russian government's perspective on these NATO war games or exercises? Does the Kremlin see it as some kind of provocation?
Well, if you look at the facts, the facts are pretty menacing, because it's not just one exercise in Poland, Anaconda. There are also two other military games organized by NATO which are taking place simultaneously. There is Iron Wolf, which is taking place in the Nordic countries, and there is Baltic Ops, or Baltic Operations, which is taking place on the territory of the former Soviet Union in Lithuania and Latvia. So, of course, it is seen with concern in Moscow, because for the first time since 1941, even The Guardian daily reported it, for the first time since 1941, the German tanks rolled through all of the Polish territory, from the German border to the former Soviet border. So that is seen as something pretty menacing, because there are 30,000 people taking part in these exercises, including 40,000 American troops.
There was a recent report in Sputnik International, and it stated that these war games, and I'm quoting here, are a bid to reignite the Cold War intended to force Moscow to starve its domestic economy, to ramp up its military to meet a growing external threat. What do you see as NATO's motivation in carrying out these exercises?
Well, NATO's motivation is a big secret, which I think future historians will be able to decipher, because it is quite clear that when the NATO leaders say that Russia is an aggressor, that sounds very strange to us, because if the West had not operated a military coup in Kiev, which lasted for 3 months, Russia would have never taken Crimea back, and Crimeans would not run away from Ukraine as they did voting for reunification with Russia. And when we hear accusations that Russia is expansionist, well, it's enough to look at the map of NATO and the Soviet Union in 1991 and to look at the map of NATO and Russia now. You will see who was expansionist all of these years and who enlarged the territory.
Right,
that was certainly not Russia, but the West.
Right, you make that point there about NATO's eastward expansion. It incorporated a number of the countries that were formerly under the influence of the Soviet Union. How does Russia see NATO as a threat right now?
It is a big question, what are NATO's motives? The worst scenario is that the United States and the European Union simply want to dominate the world, and Russia and China, being large independent countries, they are in fact one of the few remaining independent countries in the world, so they need to be removed. That's the worst case scenario. The best case scenario is that the West is simply scared of us, that the West feels threatened. But to be frank with you, I don't believe this version, because the behavior of Poland and the Baltic nations is very different from the behavior of countries which feel threatened. If you feel threatened, you don't destroy the monuments of the potential aggressor. And in fact, in Poland right now, they're destroying the monuments to Soviet soldiers who liberated Poland from the Nazis, from the German Nazis in 1940s. If you feel threatened, you don't make belligerent statements saying that your enemy is totalitarian and dangerous and bad. And these are the statements that we have been hearing from the Baltic capitals for 25 years. So it looks like the only possible scenario indeed uses every opportunity to enlarge itself and to get closer and closer to the Russian military power, in the hope, probably a vain hope, to neutralize the Russian military power.
Right. Now, earlier this week, NATO announced that it will deploy up to 4 battalions to Poland and the Baltic states. This could mean that there could be up to 4,000 NATO troops on the border with Russia. How does Russia view a development like this?
Well, this is certainly not very pleasant news for Russia, because, you know, the problem is not 4,000 NATO troops on Russia's border. Very few people believe that you can invade Russia with 4,000 men. You could do it 1,000 years ago, but not now. The problem is that the deployment of NATO forces to the west of the former Soviet border, it means that NATO no longer respects the 1997 Founding Act on relations between Russia and NATO. Let me remind you that this Founding Act was signed by Boris Yeltsin and NATO's leaders in 1997 in Paris. And that document says that NATO has no intention to deploy troops to the east of the line that once divided the Soviet Union and its Western adversaries. So this large-scale deployment of hundreds of American tanks right next to St. Petersburg in Estonia, you know, you can fly a jet in 5 minutes from St. Petersburg to Estonia. This is seen as a pretty menacing development. And don't forget that the second capital of Russia, St. Petersburg, is located just close to that area. So when is concerned about Russian planes buzzing over its ships in the Baltic, it's enough to look where the United States is located concerning the Baltics, and where the Russian territory, St. Petersburg, is located. The Russian planes in over American vessels that were in just a couple of dozens of miles from St. Petersburg, the second capital of Russia with 7 million of population.
You say these developments in Poland and the Baltic states are very menacing. Can we expect some kind of military response from Russia to these developments?
Well, actually, if you look at the strategy of President Putin, since NATO expanded to the Baltic states in 2004, Russia tried to sort of make a controlled reaction. And Mr. Putin stated it very clearly that we didn't welcome this development, but there was no hysteria in Russia around it after 2004. The message from the Kremlin to the population was that the Baltic states are not our enemies. NATO will not be able to invade Russia from their territory, so people should calm down. And now, after the tragedy in Ukraine, after so many Russian people were killed in Donbass and in other areas, people feel worried. And the Russian elite feels worried too. So there will be some kind of military response. There will be Russian troops deployed next to the Baltics, next to the Polish border, and that will not add to security in the region. Actually, an accidental confrontation, an accidental engagement of military forces in that area is not to be excluded.
Now, what about further NATO expansion? Ukraine still talks about its desire to join NATO at some point. Would that be a red line for Russia?
Well, Russia said very clearly that a formal inclusion of Ukraine in NATO will be the red line. And I think the main motive that pushed the Crimeans towards Russia and Russia towards Crimea in 2014, the main motive was to save Crimea from becoming a very dangerous military base for NATO's navy in the Black Sea. it is quite clear that the intention of the new Ukrainian regime is to join NATO. President Poroshenko and the Prime Minister Yatsenyuk and others have been saying it quite openly during the last 2 years. So de facto, Ukraine is already a NATO member because American troops are now training the so-called Ukrainian National Guard, which is fighting the Russian-speaking population in the east of Ukraine. So Russia is already very concerned by the developments in Ukraine. I think a formal inclusion of a country like Ukraine or Georgia in NATO, it may spark even more radical reaction from Russia, because these are direct threats to Russia's national security.
There are some European leaders, opinion makers, including the former Chancellor of Germany, Gerhard Schröder, who is saying that it's time now for the countries of Europe and Moscow to build better relations. And Schröder said that Germany's involvement in this NATO build-up that we've been talking about, he said, quote, "It's a big mistake." Does that encourage you that there could be some kind of deal between the two sides to diffuse tensions and assure Russia of its security?
Well, I think that Russia has been verbally reassured for so many years. For the last 30 years, Russia heard assurances from the West, from Washington, from Brussels, from Berlin, that there would be no extension of NATO, that NATO is not a threat, that Russia should feel secure. And little by little, all of these promises, all of these reassurances cracked up to be fake. So right now I think Russia needs some real concrete steps from the West that would diffuse the tensions. I think stopping the military exercise and stopping the talk about a possible aggression from Moscow would be the welcome right step. But in general, let me tell you that in fact everything that happened was just a huge mistake of President Obama and the leaders of the European Union, because it's a lose-lose situation for both sides. The previous leadership of Ukraine, headed by President Viktor Yanukovych, it was not anti-Western. There was no immediate need for the West to remove Mr. Yanukovych. He was not an enemy. And the result of the revolution, so-called revolution in Ukraine, was that Washington antagonized. It got the impoverished Ukraine on its hands. Europe has got the first civil war on its territory since the Balkan Wars ended in 1999. So it's a lose-lose situation for everyone, and the balance of President Obama, to my mind, is catastrophic. He cracked up to be worse than President Bush, the Jr., for the world peace. He does not understand anything about European politics, about security politics, and I think that sooner or later the American people will send Mr. Obama where he belongs, to the dustbin of history.
Dmitry Babich, thanks for joining us, sir. And that's it for this edition of The Heat. We'd love to hear from you, so please send us your questions, comments and story ideas to theheat@cctv-america.com, and we'd like to continue the conversation on social media. Give us your thoughts and comments on our Facebook page. You'll find that at CCTV America. I'm Arnold Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for joining us.